Hi, this is MarqueeCReW, and I would like to invite you to watch the creation of a macro. It's a CReW macro, and this will be the function of SHA256 being applied to an email address. The way that this originated was I had a requirement to SHA encrypt some data. A long time ago, I went to the community and I asked how to do that, and I created a Alteryx idea in 2014 under a different ID, which was just my name, and asked for a function for converting data to SHA256. I got a couple of responses that said, hey, you should use R. So at the time, R was the answer, and I created a macro and left it with my client. So now I'm working on the same problem, but this time I'm going to solve it with Python. And instead of leaving it with the client, I'm going to publish this to the world through Chaos Reigns within. The macro can be found, if you want to be able to search for it, on the community. And so in Alteryx community, if you go to the community.alteryx.com, go to the gallery and search there, you'll find CReW SHA256 encryption. And I've already got a comment back from Alteryx, code free, code friendly, and hope to one day get a shirt. So let's come to Alteryx and see the problem at hand. Right now, if you just wanted to MD5 your email address, you could just create MD5 email, and then there's a function for MD5, and you put in email, and you'd be able to run. And I've got two forms of email address here, Alteryx at MarqueeCReW and capital A, Alteryx at MarqueeCReW. And what happens is you'll see that it's case sensitive in reading the data, and it's going to give you different results. So we're going to want that with SHA as well, but I've put a little bit of extra functionality around that, assuming that you're going to want to lowercase the data. So if I go to insert, well, actually, I've loaded this already, so I can search for SHA and it will appear. It's in my CReW macros. And I'm going to configure email. It's only selecting string fields to be able to go through the encryption. I'm going to leave this first box unchecked and hit run. And I am getting a conversion error. Tool 14, record 2, auto convert Alteryx to lowercase. So the default action here is going to be converting to lowercase. And that way, the SHA results are the same on both versions of the email because it has made them both the lowercase version. If I don't want to do that, I can disable and hit run. And there's a slight delay here for all Python tools, and I'm only running 2 records, so it seems like it's taking more time. I've tested this with 200 million records. I run about 2 million records a minute on my computer, so that slight delay that's there is only because you're seeing the full weight of the Python tool loading up on only processing 2 records. So when I disable that conversion, I didn't get a conversion error message, and I got 2 different results for the SHA encryption. Another feature that I added to this of late was making it SHA256 underscore email, which is picking up the email name from this email here. If I made that email address My result, of course, is error on the tools because I didn't reconfigure them. We're going to change that field to email address, and I'm going to change the cleanse tool to pick up email address and hit run. Wait for the startup of Python, and it's now SHA256 underscore email address. Next, we're going to go and take a look inside of this macro to see what's actually there and under the covers. I can open up the macro, and I'm going to minimize the results so we can see a little bit more of what's going on here in the macro. And let's pan out just a little bit. And what I've done is I've created separation. This is the user interface tools that will display. And if you go to View in your tool palette, this is Interface Designer. And the Interface Designer will help you to configure these tools up here. So with them, I can see I've got this configured. I can go into a test view, and I can see here I'm going to get a drop down of select fields to encrypt and the disable button turning on and turning off. What the layout view does is it allows me to define a group of configuration. It allows me to say this select fields to import encrypt is actually coming because I dropped a tool here, and I'm changing that select fields to encrypt here is coming out of this tool where I wrote in here select fields to encrypt. Otherwise, this field here, which is disable, is actually coming from the phrase that I've put here. And now I'm able to actually type into the tool itself the text that I wanted to be able to go and explain around the description. Let's get rid of the interface designer there and then talk about the process. And I'm going to bring you through this one tool at a time, but I do want to point out that I am using containers, and I'm trying to group the processes together so that they're more readable. I have an input set of data. It doesn't really matter what input is coming in. I've used a double underscore to go around my field to make sure my field name doesn't accidentally collide with a real name. And I've got CReW input as the data field. And I've got a record ID that I'm adding. The record ID, I put the underscores on because your data might have record ID as well. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take all of your data, which I've labeled as original data in the annotation. I'm going to take all of your data, the unknown data, plus my two underscored fields, up and into a a join tool. And in that join tool, I'll join on the record ID. And what I'll essentially do is take only the unknown data, which is anything that you're presenting, along with SHA256 output. And I'm going to send that data along through to the output tool. When I do that, I expect every record ID to be present. And so I've got error messages that are going to show up in case I've got a left unjoined or a right unjoined record. There would be error messages presented, and otherwise I'll just have the select, and I'll rename the select as SHA256 underscore field name. Now field name isn't email, and it isn't email underscore address or email space address. It's none of the above. And that's because I've got an action tool. And that action tool is connected back to the selected field to encrypt. So when I selected email address, this has a formula which is replace the destination, and the destination is SHA256 underscore field name, and I'm going to replace field name with whatever came into input number 1 of this tool, which in our case was email address. So other than that, let's show you how I actually encrypt the data. So in the encryption of the data, I'm going to create a new field, which is SHA256 input, which is going to read from the selected field. In that selected field, you can see a hint as to what's happening here is that CReW input is going to get updated in the macro from whatever field you selected. So I'll always be using SHA256 input in my macro, but the contents of that are going to change with whatever field you select. And now I'm going to make sure that I've only got these two fields, and I'm only limiting the data to the fields that are absolutely required to run the macro. 1, the record ID to join back to the original data, and 2, the SHA256 input field, which will go into encryption. We'll talk in a moment about the record ID field and why I'm actually using a record ID. We're then going to go into a detour. That detour allows me to either lowercase and show warning messages or not. And that was connected up to the disable empty uppercase warnings if checked. And so we're going to connect there, and I'm using a wireless connection, and I'm putting what it's connected to directly above it. And we'll go through the case where we've got empty data. Well, Python doesn't like getting empty data. And so here's or at least that function doesn't like empty data. And so I've got a message saying, hey, this record number, the email address is empty. And here I've got, hey, it's not in lowercase. And that not lowercase, I did use a regular expression around it, and it's looking for A to Z. And if A to Z are found in uppercase, there's a problem. And then every record is going to get lowercased. So when I don't want to do these things, it'll come down this route. When I do want to come through, it'll show up error messages and get lowercased. So the records that are not empty are going to come up to this Python tool. The ones that are empty get passed here. That's why I needed the record ID, because I'm going to change potentially the order. If I take a record ID and 1 and it was empty, it might become the last record or vice versa. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to force an input saying, hey, all of my data was empty. In that case, I need to have something. And so I'm going to put input was empty here. And what I won't do is I won't assign it a record ID. I'm going to bring the data together in a union and go into the Python tool. When I come out of the Python tool, I will remove that forced record so that if no data is passed through this process, you're not getting an error message. You would get an error message saying, hey, my records are empty, but you're not going to get an error message that's from Python saying this line of code is bad. So now I've come through with my data. I can come out, and changed the names, and all is good. The only thing left is to take a look at the Python tool, which is in production mode. Production mode is basically a static set of data that doesn't have to be checked. This is the way to save your macro if you're going to use it in the future. You don't need to be interactive except if you are developing or editing the macro. So what I'm going to show you here is that we're importing the package, and so we're getting an Alteryx, and we're getting in HashLib, and both of those functions are supported by and approved by Alteryx, in that the first two statements come as the examples from Alteryx and allow the support of Alteryx read as a function as an example. And HashLib is a library that if you get a FIPS component, a fixed build of FIPS build of Alteryx, they use the same library. There's a data frame, and you can learn more about data frames by taking some course in Python development or just Googling data frames. The data frame is then going to take the input record and store that in this data frame format. We're going to define a function, text to SHA256, which will use text data, and abbreviation of H is using that HashLib. We're going to use this 256 function, and we're going to encode that in the function, and then we're going to come back with the hashed version of 256 of your email or whatever it is that you're doing. A trick for me was then defining, we're now in data frames, and we need to come back to Alteryx fielded output. And so there's this lambda function, which is going to take the data frame row, and it's going to output it, and we're going to put in this new field of SHA256 input is where we're going to put this digested set of data, and then we're going to write the data out. I'm not a Python developer. I did need a little bit of help in this area from my friend Alex, and so we built this together, tested it, and what I want to point out about this is that you don't see any lowercase functionality in here or handling of null records, because I wanted to make sure that really the only thing that was happening in this Python tool was the conversion of the ASCII version of your email address into a SHA version of the email address. So I was really limited in my use for Python on the outset. I'm only using Python because I needed a function that wasn't supported in base A, just in Alteryx. So that's a use case where I've performed something using a language other than Alteryx. The code for that, I copied it and I pasted it into a comment box. If ever in the updating of production and interactive mode, I should lose that code, I've got a copy of it down here in a form that just won't disappear. So I'm not going to save any changes made, and I'm ready to run with the CReW macro. I hope that this was informative. It may have been a little bit long, but if you want to be able to learn more about Python and such, there are a lot of opportunities inside of the weekly challenges. There are some people that like to go and solve problems with Python. You could Google Alteryx in Python. you can look for learning courses in Academy as well. Cheers.